As the morning sun rose over the hazy gray streets of South Los Angeles, 18-year-old Aaliyah Monroe stepped off the bus heading home. Her school bag hung over one shoulder, and she had just grabbed a hot coffee from the gas station on the corner. It was a quiet, ordinary day until her life turned upside down in an instant. She hadn't even crossed the street when the blare of a siren and the crack of a megaphone startled her. "Get on the ground," a male voice shouted. Her coffee cup slipped from her hand, spilling hot liquid across the sidewalk. Before she could even grasp what was happening, Aaliyah was forced to the ground, her wrists tightly cuffed. Two white police officers, one named Simmons, the other never introduced himself, pinned her in the middle of the street, one pressing a knee into her back. A crowd quickly gathered, but no one dared to intervene. Some people recorded the scene with their phones, but most looked away and kept walking. The image was all too familiar. When a black body is pinned to the pavement, silence often takes the place of justice. Aaliyah stared up at the sky, and in her eyes there was less fear than fury and betrayal. "What's the charge?" she tried to ask, but one of the officers barked, "Don't speak," and shoved her face toward the ground. An elderly man's wallet had gone missing at the gas station, and Aaliyah had simply been the only black teen present at the time. That was it. No surveillance footage, no witness, no evidence, just assumption. Being young and black had been enough. It was the system's unwritten law, always in effect. If you're a person of color, your right to a defense comes second. Inside the police van, Aaliyah stared out the window, still trying to make sense of what had just happened. She wasn't in a uniform. No one knew who she really was. The men who had handcuffed her hadn't asked a single question. All they had seen was a label: black, young, suspicious. But those labels could never capture who Aaliyah truly was. At the station, protocol existed on paper, but not in practice. No one asked her age. No one called her family. When one officer finally tilted her chin and asked, "What's your name?" Aaliyah met his eyes and said simply, "I want my lawyer." Something shifted in the room. Her voice carried an unusual weight, a tone of familiarity, of confidence. As if she'd said those words many times before, as if this wasn't new to her. 3 hours passed in the interrogation room. No one spoke to her. Only the freezing gray walls, a flickering fluorescent light, and a silence that grew colder by the minute. Aaliyah sat upright in the chair, her hands still cuffed. But her posture was straight, unyielding. This wasn't the stance of a scared girl. It was the silence of someone containing a storm without losing control. Outside the room, one officer watched her through the screen and whispered to his partner, "There's something weird about this girl. She doesn't look away." The other nodded. "She's not from the streets. Too composed." But even this observation didn't change their approach. Because some people, armed with power granted by the system, were trained to crush first and ask questions later, especially when the person before them was a young black woman. As time wore on, a decision began to form inside Aaliyah. Silence was a kind of resistance, but this time, it wouldn't be enough. This was going to escalate. If necessary, she would expose the entire system. Her eyes flickered with resolve. She remembered who she was, what was hidden in the secret pocket of her backpack. A small black leather case. Its time hadn't come yet, but it was close. When her lawyer arrived, he was a young man with light skin, and he looked flustered until his eyes landed on Aaliyah. He froze. "Are you really Aaliyah Monroe?" he asked in a hushed voice. She nodded. The lawyer took a deep breath and said only, "All right. We need to be very careful now," because he had realized who she truly was. And this was no longer just a wrongful arrest. It was the beginning of uncovering a deep rot inside the state. The next morning, as Aaliyah walked through the heavy wooden doors of the courthouse, her steps were slow but purposeful. When she entered the courtroom, everyone still saw her as a suspect. The officers, the prosecutor, even the judge, all assumed she was just another case. But what they didn't know was that this young woman didn't just carry a storm inside her. She carried the weight of a government. When Aaliyah entered the courtroom, all eyes turned to her, not with the curiosity of a fair trial, but with the cold certainty of a society that had already passed judgment. Being black, young, and a woman, This trifecta often served as evidence in itself in the eyes of the system. As she walked toward the front rows, she could feel the weight of those stairs pressing against her back, as though with each step she was breaking down a wall built by prejudice. Judge Harold Whitman was a gray-haired man with icy eyes. Sitting behind his bench, his face betrayed neither doubt nor empathy. In his eyes, Aaliyah was just another troubled youth. As the first hearing commenced, he picked up the case file and glanced at it briefly, never looking up as he stated, "Defendant, rise." Aaliyah stood silently, but the emotion coursing through her wasn't fear. It was the sense that a reckoning was near. The prosecutor was young but exuded confidence. Her blazer was pristine, her voice firm and commanding. She accused Aaliyah of being involved in an organized theft ring. She knew the evidence was flimsy, but relied on the system's inherent trust in her authority. The defendant was at the scene, concealed her identity, and resisted questioning. "This forms a clear profile of guilt," she declared. Her words echoed in the heavy silence of the courtroom. Aaliyah glanced at her attorney. The young man wiped sweat from his brow before rising. "Yes, my client was at the scene, but she was simply on her way home. Surveillance footage clearly shows she was not involved in any theft." He paused deliberately before continuing. "And she did not conceal her identity. She simply chose not to reveal it at that moment. As you will see, it was a matter of strategic silence." A spark lit up in Aaliyah's eyes. Her lawyer had caught the signal. As the trial progressed, Aaliyah's face grew more stoic, yet her posture remained composed. She neither flinched nor faltered. When the interrogation footage was submitted into evidence, a quiet murmur spread through the room. The recordings showed her standing silently for hours, unyielding. Judge Whitman paused as he reviewed the file, then turned to the officers and asked why legal counsel had not been provided during questioning. Officer Simmons averted his eyes, muttering, "Due to high volume, the procedure was overlooked." It was at that moment that Aaliyah raised her head. The courtroom seemed to freeze. Reaching into her pocket, she slowly pulled out a small black leather case. The judge's voice sharpened. "Defendant, what are you doing?" Without a word, Aaliyah opened the case and lifted a badge into the air. The metallic letters gleaming under the lights cut through the silence like a blade. "Department of Justice, Junior Field Analyst." Every eye widened. The judge turned pale. The prosecutor dropped her file. In that instant, it wasn't just the people in the courtroom who froze. It was the broken gears of the system itself. Aaliyah gently placed the badge on the table before her. "I am not only a defendant here," she said clearly. "I am a federal employee." Her voice rang out. "This trial is not only about proving my innocence, it's about revealing who the system targets." The sentence struck like a slap. No one spoke. The judge removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead, as if trying to process the truth. The prosecutor struggled to recover. "Why wasn't this information disclosed to us?" she shouted. The defense attorney lifted his head and simply said, "My client exercised her right to withhold this information in order to test the reflexes of the system. We wanted to see how she'd be treated when her true identity was unknown." The judge's eyes widened. "Was this a setup?" Aaliyah gave a faint smile. "Number It was a reality check. And the witnesses aren't just these recordings. They are everyone present in this courtroom." The officers stood up. One looked like he wanted to speak, but stayed silent. Words were dangerous now. The judge called for a short recess. As the room emptied, journalists had already gathered outside the courtroom doors. This was no longer a private legal matter. It had become a national incident. Beyond one black young woman defending herself, this case was triggering a deeper reckoning, questioning institutions and assumptions. Aaliyah sat silently. The storm had begun, and she hadn't moved an inch. 5 minutes later, the judge returned, his face pale. He read from a document, then looked up at Aaliyah. "All charges against the defendant are hereby dismissed. The arrest violated due process, denied the right to legal counsel, and ignored constitutional protections." No applause followed, but the silence rang louder than any ovation, echoing through every conscience in the room. In that moment, it was not just an acquittal. It was a certified indictment of systemic shame. When the trial ended, Aaliyah wasn't the first to leave the courtroom. While people around her murmured and dispersed, she remained seated a moment longer, her gaze fixed on the judge's bench. That bench had just judged her, and now affirmed her freedom. But the real issue had never been just her freedom. She rose in silence, slipped her badge into her pocket, and held her head high. Today, she hadn't stood only for herself. She had stood for countless others whose voices had been silenced. As she descended the courthouse steps, a crowd of reporters awaited her. Cameras flashed, microphones were thrust forward, and questions were hurled one after another. Why did you hide your identity? Was this some kind of social experiment? Do you think the system is broken? Aaliyah responded with just one sentence. I wanted to see how they'd act when I was silent. Can you hear me now? In that moment, not only the microphones, but society itself fell quiet. The story spread across national media. Headlines read, Young Black Justice Analyst's Silent Victory, Cracks in the Mirror of the System, and Faced Justice Without Revealing Her Identity. But Aaliyah wasn't after fame. What mattered to her was whether the mirror she held up to the system would spark real change. Because surface-level reform didn't mean the inner structure had healed. A formal statement from the Ministry of the Interior confirmed that Officer Simmons and the other police involved in the arrest were under investigation. It offered Aaliyah partial comfort, but she knew that real justice would require a longer journey. The investigations had begun, but true reform demanded public awareness, consistent media scrutiny, and most importantly, ensuring these incidents would never be repeated. Aaliyah returned to her job, but now she wasn't just doing desk work. She took active roles in internal training and social justice seminars for youth. In every speech, she recalled that courtroom moment when she stood in silence. The time you need to speak the most is when everyone wants you to be quiet, she would say. That phrase quickly went viral on social media. Her quiet resistance became a beacon, especially for young Black women. Law schools began teaching her case as a precedent. Justice wasn't just about courtrooms with white walls. It was about the communities that had lost their voice. Aaliyah, with her silence, had become their voice. No longer just an analyst, she had become a symbol, the embodiment of the journey from invisibility to visibility. One of the most powerful lines recorded in the court transcripts came from the judge's closing remarks. It wasn't our identities that should have been judged, but our prejudices. Those words had echoed in courtrooms for years, but this time they finally carried real weight. Aaliyah copied them into her journal, and below it she added, "But first we must judge those who judge us without knowing who we are." That was her justice philosophy, justice turned inside out, yet more honest than ever. 1 year later, during a guest lecture in a university amphitheater, Aaliyah's eyes settled on a young girl in the front row. The girl's eyes carried both fear and hope. As Aaliyah wrapped up her speech, she approached her and asked, "What's your name?" The girl whispered, "Naomi." Aaliyah smiled. "Naomi, thank you for being here today, because even when you stay silent, someone will keep speaking for you." That was the chain of hope she had passed on. For Aaliyah, the true measure of victory wasn't in applause. It was in the silence that had been broken. She wasn't someone who shouted for the system to change. She had dismantled it quietly from within. Her story wasn't a tale of heroism or victimhood. It was resistance, slow, strategic, and deeply disruptive. The shield of justice no longer lay in unseen hands, but in the mouths that dared to speak. So, who will speak for you when you're silent? Is there someone who will be your voice in the quiet? Aaliyah's story doesn't end here, because every day in another courtroom, another precinct, another street, a different Aaliyah is being questioned, suppressed, ignored, and each of them one day will speak. Maybe one day one of those voices will be yours. Remember, justice is not the legacy of those who seek it, but of those who dare to reveal it.